Hello. So there are a number of things I want to cover in this video, so bear with me. It's probably going to be a longer video. Um, First thing I want to say is that I'm on a bit of a roll of videos. I'll try to get around comments here and there, but I kind of have a policy on my channel of not replying to each and every individual comment, simply because I don't want to get into a long discussion thread on the comment section. I try to keep my opinions to the video itself, and people can either agree or disagree with me or debate among themselves. But it's not that I'm ignoring the comments. I do recognize that people are taking the time to comment, so thanks for that. Also, at the moment, I just found out about an hour ago that my grandfather passed away, so I'm going to be traveling. I don't know if I'm going to be able to upload videos or not, but obviously I'm a bit distracted. So this is one I wanted to speak about though, which is the issue of crime, particularly in Latin America. So last night I was watching this film, City of Men. It's a 2007 film. It's the sequel that's actually based on a TV series to City of God, or in Portuguese, Cidade de Deo, I think it's called. Um, and it's about basically life in a violent Rio de Janeiro slum. And two boys who grew up as friends, they get caught up in a gang war. One of them's trying to seek his father. It's um, it's I think in terms of comparing it to the first film, there's definitely similarities in the style. But anyway, I was also reading, it's keeping to that theme that my mind is on at the moment. I was also reading an article in National Geographic dated March 2019, so last month, and it's focusing on violence in El Salvador. It's quite a comprehensive report and very eye-opening. This is by, just see if I can find it. It's by Jason Motlag, photographs by Moises Salmon. I hope I'm pronouncing those names correctly. But basically, it's exploring why El Salvador, very small country, is so violent. And it really is. I mean, pretty much every statistic puts El Salvador either in number one or in the top five most dangerous countries in the world for homicides. That is outside war zones. So obviously, there's active wars going on in Syria, in Yemen, in South Sudan, the war against Boko Haram. So they are war zones. But in terms of countries that are not formally at war, but in a situation of I mean, a good comparison here would be Mexico. Mexico has a formal war situation, the Mexico drug war, which has cost over 150,000 lives. But the actual ratio of homicides in Mexico is significantly less than El Salvador. And yet, Mexico's in a state of war. At least some of the country is. El Salvador isn't. El Salvador, of course, went through a very bloody war from 1978 to 1992, or 1979 to 1992, I should say. Around 75,000 people killed. Um, but just to read out some of the statistics here, this is from the Wikipedia article, and the National Geographic article would collaborate with this. Um, Recently in the UK, we've been talking about the rise of violent knife crime, and that is definitely something that we're rightly concerned about because it is on the rise. But I do think it is important that we put things in context and our media put things in context. Actually, the UK is one of the safest countries in the world in terms of violent crime. We currently have a homicide rate that is per 100,000 people of 1.20 per 100,000 people. We are way, way, way down the list. Um, Slightly higher than Germany, below Romania, but Western Europe in general has very, very low homicide rates compared to um, much of the world. China is extremely low, 0.62. Some countries in the Middle East, Oman, is extremely low. Norway is extremely low. Indonesia is extremely low. That's assuming these figures are reliable. But almost without exception, the top, say, 20 countries are all in Latin America. The exceptions are Lesotho in southern Africa, South Africa, which isn't surprising, um, and the Central African Republic, which is a war zone. All the other countries are in Central and South America, all of them. And the very top of the list, the latest figure available is from 2016, is El Salvador. 82.84 people are murdered per 100,000 people in El Salvador. That is a staggering figure. Second is Honduras, 56.52. Third, Venezuela, 56.33. So these are three very violent countries. Venezuela, of course, for those who kind of point to it as a socialist utopia, well, that really puts a shadow on that. I mean, under Chavez and Maduro, it's become an incredibly violent country. But anyway, let me just focus on El Salvador for now. This article in the National Geographic, I'm going to show you a few pictures because they're very graphic. This caption says members of the MS-13 gang crowd into their cramped cell inside Chalatenango prison in northern El Salvador. Authorities house rival gangs in separate prisons to avoid deadly riots, but extreme crowding has stretched the prison system beyond its limits. In El Salvador, where gangs have the markings, particularly MS-13, it understandably carries a social stigma, but that then becomes a cycle that makes it hard for gang members to get jobs and so on. But there is a lot of reasons why El Salvador is so violent. There's been a long-standing wealth poverty gap there, and I consider myself conservative on crime, just for the record. Um, what these MS-13 gang leaders do, they're little better than terrorists. But this is a very complex situation, and I might somewhat retract something I said previously. I made a video a while back about the American immigration debate, and I kind of defended President Trump because I said that every country in the world has a right to protect its borders and to control immigration. Now, I stand by that. I still believe that's the case. And I do believe the likes of CNN and the Democrats have distorted some of the things he said. For example, he did not call all Mexican people animals. That is just a lie. He called MS-13 animals. And when you consider some of the things that they do, really, who's going to really argue with that? But it was distorted. Now, reading this report, apparently there's a policy in the United States, and it is known as the temporary protected status. So Salvadorans who was fleeing the civil war and went on to settle in the United States, um, okay, many of them were undocumented, but they were not violent criminals. They were not MS-13 gang members. Many of them, in every other sense, were law-abiding. Um, this article reports about one young man who was basically threatened by the gangs to join up. And he instead tried to join the police in El Salvador. They threatened his life, so he had to flee to the United States. So when he arrived in the US, he kind of kept a low profile, but he didn't get involved in gangs. He didn't break the law in any other sense except that he was undocumented. Now, because Trump's overturning this policy, he could be sent back, and he could well be killed. Um, and I'm not going to sort of microanalyze every. Excuse me, my laptop almost fell down there. I'm not going to microanalyze every aspect of this, but it is quite eye-opening. And if you get a chance, I would urge you to read the report because it does. I'll be honest, it made me rethink some of my positions a little bit. I kind of taken a quite a conservative line. Oh well, Trump's just doing what the Democrats haven't done. He's taking action for controlling immigration. I do believe that the fundamental argument of taking the legal approach um, versus those who don't take the legal avenue, that's a valid one. But ending this TPS is going to endanger lives. I mean, I've no sympathy for MS-13 gang members who settled in California and other states and brought, the violence of Latin America into the states. I have absolutely no sympathy with them. They are thugs, they are criminals, and I have no sympathy with them. But I do sympathize with young men who are in a position whereby their lives are threatened. Either join the gang or we kill you. And that's something that really needs to be explored. There are a lot of socio-economic things going on here, but it's kind of a vicious cycle. And then they're going back. Obviously, when they go back to El Salvador, it leads to the situation there being overburdened. I mean, look at this map. A bit hard to see because it's a black background, but basically, every red dot there represents a murder. In 2017, El Salvador recorded 3,752 homicides. Yep, is that right? I think the country's, no, 3,962 homicides. I believe it's got a population of about 5 or 6 million. So that's a staggeringly high figure. Um, and I think that violence there is so endemic, and it's probably similar in Honduras, that people become desensitized. Probably people are suffering some sort of post traumatic stress as they would in a war zone. I mean, it's basically a war zone, undeclared. Um, in fact, the statistics may well work out that more people are being murdered today than even during the Civil War. If 75,000 people died over 13 years of the Civil War, when you break that down, the murder rate today is probably similar to the number of deaths being recorded during the Civil War. So that's staggering. Incidentally, the United States, which is more violent than Western European countries, is way, way down the list as well, compared to South America and Latin America. The United States is 5.35 murders per 100,000 people, which puts it between Zambia and Ecuador. In fact, Mongolia is slightly higher than the United States. So that's worth considering. This is a tragic situation. Actually, according to this report, the only country that ranks higher than El Salvador is Venezuela. So, like I say, Venezuela, Honduras, El Salvador, those three countries kind of fluctuate over which one is at the top, but all three are very violent. And it's just a desensitized part of society. I think that there's a lot of things that need to be looked at. Obviously, poverty is a factor, but it's also, I think there needs to be, I think gang leaders need to be targeted because young men who are being threatened, with their lives, if they join a gang or not, um, I have more sympathy for them. The leaders, those who pressurize them to join, those who, I mean, we're seeing a similar thing in the UK where gang initiation is how many, like where you stab someone on the body, and the situation in the UK is not like it's way, way, way not even close to this. But this is a vicious cycle because these migrants go to the United States. They try to be upstanding citizens, and yes, some of them do go to MS-13 and the 18th Street gang. But I think the problem is that most of them don't. But those who do are criminals, and they are, the Democrats are wrong to not recognize and to not condemn vocally the likes of the MS-13, which in my view are little better than terrorists. Uh, but this is a very complicated situation, and I think that, I mean, honestly, this report evaluates it much better than I'm doing. But tackling the root cause is obviously a factor. Jobs, all those sort of issues are also factors. But I think that it's very difficult to know what the answer is here because I mean, what Trump's policy could be doing is literally condemning people to death who are not involved in gangs. Graphic. photograph of a suspected thief on a bus in San Salvador. Um, so what's the answer? I don't know, honestly. I don't know what the answer is, but this is obviously a cycle of violence. Disillusioned young men settled in the United States. They then formed MS-13 in the 18th Street Gang. I have no sympathy with them. I think, they're callous criminals. I'm talking about the leaders. Um, but, sending like collective punishment for all undocumented migrants, I think that is a big problem. Separating families. And it is true that there is a bit of hypocrisy in the side of the Democrats. Obama also enacted a lot of this policy when he was president. So, the focus on Trump is a bit. I think it's because Trump's kind of his own worst enemy with the sort of comments he comes out with. But the comments about animals, that was not about all Mexicans. It was not about all Salvadorians or Hondurans. It was specifically about MS-13, and his critics know that. I mean, what do they have to say to innocent Americans or other Latin Americans who have, lost loved ones because of these thugs? So I absolutely think Trump is right to take a very hard line on gangs, but ending the TPS scheme, I think I'll be honest, I was ignorant about that before. I didn't really know about that. So ending that, I think, is could potentially be condemning people whose only crime is to be undocumented to, gangs then killing them. I mean, I understand that amnesty is a controversial subject, but surely if the only thing they have done wrong is beyond documented, if they are not gang members, if they haven't robbed or raped or done anything, committed any serious crimes, then surely it would make more sense to have some sort of amnesty. And that would actually make it easier, surely, to hunt down actual gang members and deport them. And I think they should be deported. I think every country has a right to deport violent criminals. Um, as for El Salvador, it's the problem with developing countries, and it's the same in the Philippines. It's all very well for those of us in developed countries to say, "Oh, these prisons are hellholes, and they should, put more money into the prison system." But the problem is, the countries are poor generally, so they'll argue rationally that they don't have the money to make better facilities in prison. But it's a vicious cycle, because obviously, if you're cramming people in like that, like animals, then it's not going to help in terms of reform. Um, so it's a very difficult situation. I think the United States, it's the most powerful country in the world. It should be putting money into schemes to alleviate poverty in Latin America, and it probably does, to be fair. I'm sure the United States has pumped billions into those sort of programs. It must always also be said, though, that successive American presidents, and Trump needs to acknowledge this, both Republican and Democratic. I mean, Reagan and Bush are often named, but Jimmy Carter was not innocent. Mr. Human Rights. Even Jimmy Carter cannot claim total innocence in this. Going right back to William Howard Taft, American presidents have blood on their hands in Latin America. They propped up brutal dictators um, who ran death squads and caused misery in these countries. And then, of course, in the 70s and 80s, they broke into brutal civil wars. And then the legacy of those civil wars are still there. So ceasefires may have been signed, the political conflicts may be over, but now it's almost like a war in terms of crime. And I think the problem is it's a cycle, because people flee these countries because they're basically like war zones. So you can understand them fleeing, and they go to settle in the United States because understandably they want a better life. If I was in their shoes, I'd probably try to do the same thing. I would say Mexico's hypocritical, because Mexico doesn't exactly help migrants from poor Latin American countries. So it's a bit rich for Mexico to point fingers at the United States for racism. I will say that. But there's no easy answers to this, but I would say this though, and it's similar to Europeans looking at the migrant crisis we have from North Africa and the Middle East. Those of us who are not in this situation, those of us who have a roof over our head, who have a country, who are not facing death threats, it's fine to have conservative views on immigration and obviously on crime. I'm all with that. But we also need to acknowledge that there are people in this world living in situations we can't imagine. And I do think sometimes those of us in developed countries take it for granted. You know, if I was living in El Salvador or Honduras, would I want to get to the United States? I probably would. If I was living in Chad or Somalia, would I want to try and get into Europe? I probably would. Countries have a right to know who's coming in. Countries have a right to have control. And the United States is no exception. Just because it's a country built on immigration doesn't mean that, it should just let anybody in. I think that's incredibly naive. But by the same token, the United States did contribute a large part to the present day problems in a lot of these countries. Just as old European empires are at least partly to blame for problems in sub Saharan Africa. So there's no easy answer here, but I think that people need to be empathetic, but also not naive. So those on the left who say, "Oh, just let anyone in, Trump's a monster," they're ignoring the fact that MS-13 is a ruthless gang. They are ruthless thugs who often will target innocent people and whose actions cause misery. So I think the gang leaders should be targeted. I think that there is a real problem with young men whose only choice in life is join these gangs or end up being killed for not doing so. So those young men really need to be, governments need to do a lot more, I think, to understand the situation that they're in. Kenko Coffee, I think it was Kenko, had a program of getting young people away from gangs and into, I forget the name of the project, but it sounded like a good initiative. Um, anyway, I'll leave it there. There is no easy answer. So all I'll say is, if you get a chance, do read this article. March 2019. It's exploring why El Salvador is so violent. No Way Out, and it is by Jason Mutlag and photographs by Moises Salmon. And it really explores the issue a lot more articulately than I have. There's a picture of a migrant. I don't think it's racist, incidentally, to talk about control and about security. And I don't blame President Trump for reaching out to families of, people who have been targeted by MS-13, something the Democrats haven't done. And if these Democratic candidates for 2020 ignore them, that would be a grave mistake. But by the same token, from Trump's side, I think that ending the TPS scheme is going to condemn people to gang violence, is going to condemn people to the mercy of these gangs back in Latin America. So I think some sort of amnesty would make sense. It would surely make it easier to track down gang members, because collective punishment of all undocumented migrants, like putting someone who is not breaking the law other than the fact that they're undocumented, i.e., they're not raping anyone, they're not robbing anyone, they're not drug dealing, they're not gang members, putting them in the same bracket as hardened gang members in MS-13 or the 18th Street gang who are terrorizing, Los Angeles and San Diego, I think that's misguided. It's collective punishment. So I think both the Democrats and Republicans um, are making mistakes in this. And I also think Trump needs to acknowledge that previous administrations were responsible for a lot of the problems in Latin America. I mean, Carter, Reagan, and Bush all have blood on their hands. And I respect Jimmy Carter, but, he's not totally innocent in this either. So leave it there.